Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the quiet residential community of Palm Coast, Florida, where palm trees sway gently in the coastal breeze and families settle into comfortable suburban routines, a tragedy unfolded in April 2018 that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. This is the story of Brandy Salenza, a vibrant 25-year-old mother whose life was cut tragically short in what appeared, at first glance, to be a terrible accident. Picture a typical Saturday morning in Florida. The sun was already climbing high, casting long shadows across the well-maintained lawns of Felter Lane in Palm Coast's F section. It was the kind of morning where you might hear the distant hum of lawnmowers starting up, or catch the aroma of coffee brewing in kitchen windows. But at one house on this peaceful street, something was terribly wrong. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, a frantic 911 call pierced the calm. The caller was Keith Johansson, 39 years old, and his voice carried the unmistakable panic of someone facing an unthinkable situation. "My wife has been shot," he told the emergency dispatcher, his words tumbling over each other in apparent distress. "I think she accidentally shot herself. I was in the shower, and I heard the gunshot." The story Keith told seemed plausible enough at first. He explained that he had been taking a shower when he heard a loud bang. Rushing to investigate, he claimed he found his wife, Brandy, in their bedroom, wounded by what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The weapon, a 9mm handgun that Keith kept for home protection, was lying nearby. It was, he insisted, a terrible accident. When the first responders arrived at the modest single-story home, they found a scene that would be forever etched in their memories. Brandy Salenza lay in the master bedroom, having sustained what would prove to be fatal injuries. The responding officers noted the position of the weapon, the layout of the room, and began the meticulous process of documenting what initially appeared to be a tragic mishap. But there was another witness to this morning's events, one who couldn't speak for himself. Brandy's 6-year-old son, a little boy who had been in the house during these terrifying moments, sleeping in his room just one door away from where his mother lay dying. The child, whose name was carefully protected throughout the investigation and trial, would become a crucial but silent figure in the unfolding story. To understand the full tragedy of what happened that April morning, we need to know who Brandy Salenza really was. At 25, she was more than just a statistic in a criminal case. She was a young woman with dreams, fears, and a deep love for her son. Brandy had the kind of energy that drew people to her. Friends and family would later describe her as vibrant and caring, someone who lit up a room when she walked in. She wasn't perfect, none of us are, but she was trying to build a life for herself and her child in a world that hadn't always been kind to her. Like many young mothers, Brandy had faced her share of challenges. Raising a child is never easy, and doing so while navigating adult relationships, financial pressures, and personal struggles requires a strength that often goes unrecognized. She had been working to create stability for her son, a goal that had led her to Keith Johansson. Their relationship had begun like many modern romances, with hope and the promise of a fresh start. Keith, nearly 14 years her senior, seemed to offer the security that Brandy was seeking. He had a job, a home, and appeared to be someone who could help provide the stable family environment that every mother wants for her child. But as investigators would later discover, the reality of their relationship was far more complex than it appeared from the outside. Behind the facade of suburban normalcy, a darker dynamic was taking shape, one built on control, suspicion, and an escalating pattern of behavior that would ultimately prove deadly. When the Flagler County Sheriff's Office began their investigation, they approached the case with the thoroughness that any sudden death demands. Sheriff Rick Staley and his team understood that even apparent accidents required careful scrutiny to ensure that justice was served and that the truth, whatever it might be, would eventually come to light. The initial evidence seemed to support Keith's account. There was indeed a firearm at the scene, and Brandy had sustained what appeared to be a gunshot wound. But as investigators began to look more closely, certain details began to raise questions in their minds. The first red flag came from the medical examiner's office. When Dr. Marie Herman conducted the autopsy, she discovered something that contradicted Keith's story of an accidental shooting. Brandy hadn't been shot just once, she had been shot twice. One bullet wound was in her chest, and there was evidence of a second shot as well. Even more intriguing was the nature of the ammunition. Keith had loaded his 9mm handgun in a very specific way. The first rounds in the chamber were what are known as less lethal or non-lethal rounds, specialized ammunition designed to incapacitate rather than kill. These might be rubber bullets or other types of rounds that could wound but were not typically fatal. However, loaded behind these less lethal rounds were standard, deadly ammunition. This loading pattern suggested something that investigators found deeply troubling. It appeared that Keith had fired the weapon twice, first with a non-lethal round, then with a standard, lethal bullet. This sequence of events was difficult to reconcile with the story of an accidental shooting that Keith had told to the 911 operator and the responding officers. As the investigation continued, other inconsistencies began to emerge. The position of Brandy's body, the location of the weapon, and the blood spatter patterns in the bedroom all seemed to tell a different story than the one Keith was sharing with authorities. One of the most damaging aspects of Keith's case was his inability to maintain a consistent narrative about what had happened that April morning. As investigators pressed him for details, his story began to shift and change in ways that raised serious concerns about his credibility. Initially, as we've heard, Keith claimed that Brandy had accidentally shot herself while he was in the shower. This was the story he told to 911, and it was the version he stuck with during his first interactions with police officers at the scene. But as days turned into weeks, and the pressure of the investigation mounted, Keith's account began to evolve. Sometimes the details were small, perhaps the timing of when he heard the shot, or exactly where he was when it happened. Other times, the changes were more significant, touching on fundamental aspects of what had allegedly occurred. Investigators have seen this pattern before in cases where someone is not telling the truth. When a person is recounting a traumatic but real memory, the core details tend to remain consistent, even if some peripheral details might be fuzzy due to shock or stress. However, when someone is constructing a false narrative, they often find themselves trapped by their own lies, forced to adjust their story as new evidence emerges or as they realize that certain aspects of their tale don't hold up under scrutiny. Keith's changing stories created a problem that would plague him throughout the investigation and trial. Each time he modified his account, investigators became more convinced that he was hiding something. The question was no longer whether Brandy's death was accidental, it was whether Keith had deliberately killed his wife. In the modern age, our digital lives often tell stories that our words cannot hide. Investigators began to piece together the digital trail that surrounded Brandy and Keith's relationship, and what they found painted a picture of a marriage under severe strain. Keith had become increasingly suspicious of his wife's online activities. Like many people today, Brandy maintained social media accounts and communicated with friends and acquaintances through various digital platforms. But Keith had begun to interpret these normal social interactions as evidence of infidelity. The investigation revealed that Keith had been monitoring Brandy's online presence obsessively. He had access to her accounts, was reading her messages, and had become convinced that she was having emotional or physical relationships with other men. Whether or not there was any truth to these suspicions became irrelevant. What mattered was that Keith believed them, and his belief was driving him to increasingly controlling and aggressive behavior. This digital surveillance had created a toxic dynamic in their relationship. Brandy, like anyone, deserved to have friendships and social connections. The ability to communicate with others, to maintain relationships outside of one's marriage, is a basic human right. But Keith had begun to see these connections as threats to his control over his wife. Friends and family members would later testify that they had noticed changes in Brandy in the months leading up to her death. She had become more withdrawn, more careful about what she said and did. The vibrant young woman who had once been so full of life was beginning to show signs of someone living under constant scrutiny and control. As the investigation progressed through 2018, the Flagler County Sheriff's Office was building a methodical case against Keith Johansen. On April 9, just 2 days after Brandy's death, the medical examiner officially ruled her death a homicide. This ruling was based on the autopsy findings, the ballistics evidence, and the impossibility of reconciling Keith's various stories with the physical evidence at the scene. The investigation involved multiple search warrants, extensive laboratory testing, and interviews with dozens of people who had known both Keith and Brandy. Each piece of evidence added to a growing picture of premeditated murder rather than accidental death. On April 27, 2018, exactly 20 days after Brandy's death, Keith Johansen was arrested at his home and charged with second-degree murder. The arrest came after weeks of careful investigation, during which Keith had been free but under intense scrutiny. Sheriff Staley announced the arrest to the media, explaining that the evidence clearly showed that this was not an accident or a suicide, but a deliberate homicide. Keith was booked into the Flagler County Jail and held without bond, a decision that reflected both the seriousness of the charges and the court's assessment that he posed a potential danger to the community. The path to justice in the Brandy Salenza case would prove to be long and winding. Keith's defense team would attempt multiple strategies over the years leading up to his trial, each one reflecting their desperate attempts to find some way to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Initially, Keith's lawyers seemed prepared to argue that Brandy's death was indeed accidental, as Keith had originally claimed. But as the evidence mounted and the impossibility of this explanation became clear, they were forced to pivot to other defenses. At one point, the defense suggested that Brandy had died by suicide, that she had deliberately shot herself, perhaps in a moment of despair or mental anguish. This argument faced the same problems as the accident theory. It couldn't explain the 2 gunshot wounds, the specific ammunition loading pattern, or the physical evidence at the scene. By the time the case finally went to trial, Keith's defense team had settled on yet another strategy: self-defense. They would argue that Brandy had pointed the gun at Keith, threatening him, and that he had acted to protect his own life. This was a dramatic departure from his original claim that he had been in the shower when the shooting occurred, and it required the jury to believe that Keith had lied repeatedly to police and emergency responders about the most basic facts of what had happened. When Keith Johansen's trial began in earnest, the courtroom was filled with family members, friends, and community members who had followed this case for years. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys from the state attorney's office, laid out a methodical case that painted Keith as a controlling husband who had killed his wife in a fit of rage over her perceived infidelities. The evidence they presented was compelling. The medical examiner testified about the 2 gunshot wounds and explained why the physical evidence was inconsistent with either an accident or suicide. Ballistics experts walked the jury through the unusual ammunition loading pattern and what it suggested about Keith's intentions. Perhaps most damaging to Keith's case were his own words. The prosecution played recordings of his various statements to police, highlighting the inconsistencies and changes in his story over time. They argued that these shifting narratives showed a guilty consciousness, the behavior of a man who knew he had committed murder and was desperately trying to cover it up. The defense, now arguing self-defense, faced an uphill battle. They had to convince the jury that Keith had acted reasonably in defending himself, while also explaining why he had lied about being in the shower and why his story had changed so many times. They suggested that Keith had been in shock, that trauma can cause people to remember events differently, and that Brandy had indeed posed a threat to his life. But the prosecution's case was thorough and methodical. They presented evidence about the couple's troubled relationship, Keith's obsessive monitoring of his wife's activities, and the pattern of control and abuse that had characterized their marriage. They argued that this was not a case of self-defense, but rather the culmination of Keith's need to control his wife taken to its ultimate, deadly extreme. After hearing weeks of testimony, examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, and listening to arguments from both sides, the jury began their deliberations. The case had been complex, involving technical ballistics evidence, medical testimony, and competing narratives about what had happened that April morning in 2018. But the jury's decision came relatively quickly. After just under 3 hours of deliberation, they returned to the courtroom with their verdict. Keith Johansen was guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his wife, Brandy Salenza. The conviction on first-degree murder charges meant that the jury had found not only that Keith had killed his wife, but that he had done so with premeditation, that this was not a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity, but a deliberate, planned act of violence. The guilty verdict brought a sense of closure to Brandy's family and friends, though nothing could truly heal the wound left by her loss. For her young son, now growing up without his mother, the verdict meant that there was at least some measure of justice for the woman who had loved him so deeply. In Florida, first-degree murder carries the possibility of life imprisonment or, in certain circumstances, the death penalty. Given the evidence in Keith's case and the jury's findings, the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence meant that Keith Johansen, who was 39 years old at the time of his conviction, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He would never again walk free, never again have the opportunity to harm another person, and never again be able to exercise the kind of control over another human being that had led to Brandy's death. The judge's comments at sentencing reflected the severity of Keith's crime and its impact on all those who had known and loved Brandy. The court noted that Keith had not only taken a young woman's life but had also traumatized a 6-year-old child who would have to grow up knowing that his stepfather had murdered his mother. As is common in serious criminal cases, Keith's legal team filed an appeal of his conviction, arguing that there had been errors in the trial process that warranted overturning the jury's verdict. They raised various technical legal arguments about evidence that should or shouldn't have been admitted, jury instructions that they claimed were improper, and other procedural issues. However, in April 2023, the 5th District Court of Appeal upheld Keith's conviction and life sentence. The appellate court found that while there might have been minor technical issues with some aspects of the trial, none of these rose to the level of reversible error that would require a new trial or a different outcome. This appellate decision meant that Keith's conviction was final, and he would indeed spend the rest of his life in prison for the murder of Brandy Salenza. He is currently serving his sentence at a state prison in Lowell, Florida, where he will remain until his death. The murder of Brandy Salenza sent shockwaves through the Palm Coast community, where violent crimes of this nature are relatively rare. Friends and neighbors struggled to understand how a seemingly normal suburban marriage could have hidden such darkness, and how the warning signs of domestic violence might have been missed or ignored. For those who work in the field of domestic violence prevention, Brandy's case highlighted many of the classic patterns that can escalate to lethal violence. Keith's obsessive monitoring of his wife's digital communications, his controlling behavior, and his apparent belief that he had the right to dictate every aspect of her social interactions were all red flags that experts recognize as indicators of potentially dangerous domestic abuse. The case also underscored the particular vulnerability of women who are trying to leave or change abusive relationships. While we may never know exactly what precipitated the violence on that April morning in 2018, it's possible that Keith sensed that he was losing control over his wife, and that this perception triggered the deadly assault. Most tragically, Brandy's son lost his mother to senseless violence. The boy, who was just 6 years old when Keith murdered Brandy, will carry the trauma of this experience throughout his life. While his identity has been carefully protected, and while he is hopefully receiving the support and counseling he needs, there is no erasing the fundamental tragedy of what happened to his family. As we reflect on the case of Brandy Salenza, several important lessons emerge that extend far beyond the specific details of this tragedy. First, the case demonstrates how domestic violence often escalates gradually, with controlling behavior building over time until it reaches a deadly crescendo. Keith's obsession with monitoring Brandy's online activities might have seemed like jealousy or concern to some observers, but it was actually a form of stalking and control that placed Brandy in increasing danger. Second, the case shows how important it is for investigators to look beyond initial appearances when examining suspicious deaths. The first responders to Felter Lane that morning might easily have accepted Keith's story of an accidental shooting and closed the case. Instead, their careful attention to detail and willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led ultimately brought a killer to justice. Third, Brandy's story reminds us of the human cost of domestic violence. She wasn't just a victim, she was a young woman with hopes and dreams, a mother who loved her child, and a person whose life had value far beyond the circumstances of her death. The ripple effects of her murder will continue to affect her family, friends, and community for years to come. Finally, the case highlights the crucial role that technology now plays in both facilitating abuse and solving crimes. Keith's digital stalking of his wife was enabled by modern technology, but that same technology also provided investigators with crucial evidence that helped convict him of murder. In the wake of Brandy's murder and Keith's conviction, the Palm Coast community has worked to honor her memory while also raising awareness about domestic violence. Local organizations have used her case as an example of why it's so important for friends, family members, and neighbors to recognize the warning signs of abuse and to speak up when they see them. Domestic violence advocates have pointed to several red flags that were present in Keith and Brandy's relationship: his controlling behavior, his obsessive monitoring of her activities, and his apparent belief that he had the right to dictate whom she could speak to and how she could interact with others. These behaviors, while they might not seem immediately threatening, are actually strong predictors of escalating abuse. The case has also reinforced the importance of supporting survivors of domestic violence and ensuring that they have access to resources and assistance when they need to leave dangerous relationships. While we'll never know whether Brandy was planning to leave Keith or change their relationship in some way, her case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is often when they are trying to assert their independence or leave the relationship entirely. Throughout this tragic story, perhaps no one deserves our compassion more than Brandy's son. At 6 years old, he witnessed something that no child should ever see or experience. The trauma of losing his mother to violence, and knowing that his stepfather was responsible for her death, will likely affect him for the rest of his life. Child psychologists who work with survivors of domestic violence emphasize that children in these situations need extensive, long-term support to process what they've experienced and to develop healthy relationships in the future. They also need to be reassured, again and again, that what happened was not their fault and that they are safe now. While the boy's specific circumstances have been kept private to protect him, we can hope that he has been placed in a loving, stable environment where he can begin to heal from this trauma. The support of extended family, professional counselors, and his broader community will be crucial as he grows up and learns to make sense of what happened to his mother. His story also serves as a reminder of why domestic violence prevention is so important. When adults choose violence, children are often the unintended victims who suffer consequences they did nothing to deserve. The murder of Brandy Salenza serves as a stark reminder of why domestic violence prevention and education are so crucial in our communities. While it's impossible to prevent every tragedy, there are steps that individuals and communities can take to reduce the risk of domestic violence escalating to murder. Education about the warning signs of abuse is critical. Friends and family members need to know that controlling behavior, like monitoring someone's communications, dictating whom they can see or speak to, or becoming angry about normal social interactions, can be predictive of more serious violence to come. Communities also need to ensure that there are resources available for people who are experiencing domestic violence. This includes not just emergency services like shelters and hotlines, but also longer-term support like counseling, legal assistance, and help with housing and employment for people who are trying to leave abusive relationships. Perhaps most importantly, we all need to create environments where people feel safe speaking up about abuse. Too often, victims of domestic violence suffer in silence because they fear they won't be believed, or because they're ashamed of what's happening to them. Creating cultures of support and belief can save lives. As we come to the end of Brandy Salenza's story, it's important to remember that while this case ended with justice being served, it began with a preventable tragedy. A young woman lost her life, a child lost his mother, and a community lost one of its members to senseless violence. Keith Johansen will spend the rest of his life in prison for his crime, and that is appropriate given the severity of what he did. But no amount of punishment can bring Brandy back or undo the trauma that her son experienced. The real victory would have been preventing this tragedy from happening in the first place. Brandy's story reminds us that domestic violence can happen in any community, at any socioeconomic level, and to people of any age or background. It's not something that only happens to other people, it's a reality that affects millions of families across the country. But her story also reminds us that justice is possible, that careful investigation and prosecution can hold killers accountable for their crimes, and that communities can come together to support survivors and prevent future tragedies. As you reflect on Brandy's story, remember her not just as a victim of violence, but as a young woman who loved her son, who was trying to build a better life for her family, and whose memory deserves to be honored by our commitment to preventing domestic violence in all its forms. May she rest in peace, and may her son find healing and happiness in the years ahead. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we're traveling to Oshawa, Ontario, Canada, to explore a case that began with a routine plumbing call and unraveled into one of the most disturbing murder investigations in recent Canadian history. This is the story of 18-year-old Rory Hatch, whose tragic end would expose secrets buried for nearly a decade. Rory Hatch was just 18 years old when her life came to a violent end in September 2017. Like many young people her age, Rory was navigating the challenges of transitioning into adulthood, but her path was complicated by circumstances that made her vulnerable. She had been experiencing homelessness and struggled with drug addiction, challenges that unfortunately left her on the margins of society, where danger often lurks in the shadows. Rory's mother, Shannon Dion, would later make it clear during the trial proceedings that her daughter's struggles didn't define her worth. This trial was not about her daughter being homeless or a drug addict toss-away that wasn't loved, she stated firmly outside the courtroom. Rory was loved, she was valued, and her life mattered. In the late summer of 2017, Rory's life intersected with that of a man named Adam Strong, a resident of Oshawa who lived in a basement apartment on Macmillan Drive. This intersection would prove fatal for the young woman who was already fighting so many battles. What makes Rory's story particularly heartbreaking is that at the time of her death, she was pregnant. This detail adds another layer of tragedy to an already devastating case, reminding us that her murder claimed not just one life, but two. September 11, 2017, started like any other day in Oshawa. The early autumn weather was still pleasant enough for outdoor activities, and many residents were taking advantage of what might be some of the last warm days before winter settled in across Ontario. A local fisherman had made his way to the Oshawa harbor, perhaps hoping to catch something for dinner or simply to enjoy the peaceful solitude that comes with casting a line into the calm waters of Lake Ontario. The harbor was a popular spot for such activities, offering a serene escape from the hustle and bustle of daily life. But on this particular morning, instead of the usual debris or perhaps a boot or two that occasionally surfaces in urban harbors, the fisherman spotted something that would forever change his peaceful morning routine. Floating in the water was what appeared to be a human torso. The discovery was immediately reported to authorities, and Durham Regional Police quickly responded to the scene. What they found confirmed the fisherman's terrible suspicions. This was indeed human remains, specifically the torso of what appeared to be a young woman. The remains were carefully recovered and transported for examination. Forensic experts began the painstaking process of trying to identify the victim, but without a head or limbs, this would prove to be a challenging task. The investigation had begun, but it would be months before authorities would have any real answers about who this person was or how they had ended up in Lake Ontario. Fast forward to a seemingly ordinary Tuesday in December 2017. In a basement apartment on McMillan Drive in Oshawa, a routine maintenance issue was about to become something much more sinister. The tenant had been experiencing problems with his plumbing, a common enough issue in older buildings, especially during the winter months when pipes are more prone to freezing and blocking. A plumber was called to address what appeared to be a straightforward clogged drain. These are the kinds of calls that service professionals handle dozens of times each week, usually caused by hair, soap buildup, or items that shouldn't have gone down the drain in the first place. The plumber arrived at the McMillan Drive address and began his standard diagnostic routine. He traced the problem through the system, following the pipes to locate the source of the blockage. What he found when he reached the obstruction, however, was anything but standard. Mixed in with the typical debris one might expect to find in blocked pipes, the plumber discovered what appeared to be human tissue and flesh. The sight was so shocking and unmistakable that there was no question about what he was looking at. This wasn't some animal remains or unusual organic matter, this was human flesh that had been deliberately disposed of through the plumbing system. The plumber immediately stopped his work and placed a call to 911. The call, which would later be played during court proceedings, captured his shock and the surreal nature of what he had discovered. Here was a professional going about his routine work, only to stumble upon evidence of what was clearly a serious crime. When Durham Regional Police arrived at the McMillan Drive basement apartment, they quickly realized they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple plumbing issue. The tenant of the apartment was Adam Strong, a 48-year-old man who would soon become the focus of an intensive homicide investigation. As officers began to process the scene, they made additional disturbing discoveries. Beyond the human remains found in the plumbing system, investigators uncovered more evidence of foul play throughout the apartment. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of human remains that had been stored in the apartment's freezer, a detail that spoke to the calculated and disturbing nature of the crimes that had taken place there. But the investigation revealed something else that would expand the scope of the case dramatically. Among the evidence collected, investigators found traces of DNA that didn't match the remains from the harbor. This DNA belonged to another young woman, one who had been missing for nearly a decade. The second set of remains belonged to Candace Fitzpatrick, a 19-year-old woman who had vanished without a trace in 2008. For 9 years, her family had wondered what had happened to her, hoping against hope that she might still be alive somewhere. The discovery at Strong's apartment finally provided them with answers, though not the ones they had been praying for. This revelation transformed the investigation from a single homicide case into a double murder inquiry spanning nearly 10 years. It suggested that Adam Strong had been killing young women and disposing of their bodies from his basement apartment for close to a decade, perfecting his methods of concealment and disposal over time. With the discovery of evidence linking both Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick to Adam Strong's apartment, investigators began the complex process of building their case. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to match DNA evidence, while detectives pieced together the timelines of both women's disappearances. The connection to Rory Hatch became clear when DNA testing confirmed that the torso found floating in Oshawa Harbor in September 2017 belonged to her. The remainder of her remains, discovered in Strong's apartment, completed the grim picture of what had happened to the young woman. For Candace Fitzpatrick, the case was more challenging. She had disappeared in 2008, and unlike Rory's case, there had been no body parts discovered elsewhere. The only evidence of her fate was found within Strong's apartment, DNA traces and tissue samples that told the story of another young life cut short. Investigators discovered that Strong had developed an elaborate system for disposing of human remains. After killing his victims in the apartment, he would dismember their bodies and attempt to dispose of the evidence through multiple methods. Some remains would be flushed down the toilet or washed down drains, while other parts might be stored temporarily in his freezer or disposed of in Lake Ontario. This methodical approach to body disposal suggested that Strong had given considerable thought to concealing his crimes. It wasn't the work of someone acting in a moment of passion or panic, but rather the calculated actions of someone who had planned for and anticipated the need to hide evidence of murder. In November 2018, more than a year after the discovery of Rory's torso in the harbor, Adam Strong was formally arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The charges related to both Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick, marking the culmination of a complex and lengthy investigation. First-degree murder charges in Canada are reserved for the most serious cases, those involving planning and deliberation, or murders committed during the course of other serious crimes. The decision to charge Strong with first-degree murder suggested that prosecutors believed they could prove that these weren't impulsive acts of violence, but rather planned and premeditated killings. Strong was also initially charged with improper or indecent interference with a body regarding Hatch's case, though this charge would later be dropped as prosecutors focused on the more serious murder charges. The arrest brought some measure of closure to the families of both victims, though it also meant they would have to endure the painful process of a lengthy trial where the details of their loved ones' final moments would be examined in excruciating detail. For Rory's mother, Shannon Dion, the arrest was a step toward justice, but it couldn't bring back her daughter or erase the trauma of losing a child in such a violent way. Similarly, Candace Fitzpatrick's family finally had answers about what had happened to their loved one, but those answers came with the devastating confirmation that she had been dead for over a decade. When Adam Strong's trial finally began, it would reveal disturbing details about the murders and the extent of Strong's efforts to conceal his crimes. The prosecution's case relied heavily on forensic evidence, DNA analysis, and the physical evidence recovered from Strong's apartment and the harbor. During the proceedings, the court heard testimony from the plumber who had made the initial discovery. His 911 call was played for the jury, capturing his shock and disbelief at finding human remains in what should have been a routine plumbing job. This testimony helped establish the timeline and circumstances of how the crimes were discovered. Forensic experts testified about their analysis of the remains and the DNA evidence that linked both victims to Strong's apartment. They described the challenging process of identifying victims from partial remains and piecing together the evidence of how the crimes had been committed. Perhaps most disturbing were the details that emerged about Strong's methods. The prosecution alleged that he had killed Rory Hatch by repeatedly striking her in the head with a hammer or similar object while she was restrained. The judge would later find that this constituted a particularly brutal and calculated murder. The trial also revealed that Strong had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for disposing of human remains over the years. The gap between Candace Fitzpatrick's murder in 2008 and Rory Hatch's murder in 2017 suggested that Strong had been refining his techniques, learning from experience how to better conceal evidence of his crimes. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, Justice D. Luca delivered the verdict in March 2021. Adam Strong was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Rory Hatch and manslaughter in the death of Candace Fitzpatrick. The different verdicts for the 2 cases reflected the varying strength of evidence available for each murder. For Rory's case, the prosecution had successfully proven premeditation and planning, meeting the legal standard for first-degree murder. For Candace's case, while Strong was clearly responsible for her death, the passage of time and limited physical evidence made it more difficult to prove the same level of premeditation, resulting in the lesser conviction of manslaughter. In May 2021, Strong was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years for Rory's murder. He also received an 18-year sentence for Candace's manslaughter, to be served concurrently. At 48 years old at the time of sentencing, Strong would be in his 70s before he could even be considered for parole. The sentencing brought a measure of justice to the families, though it could never truly compensate for their losses. For both families, the trial had been a long and painful process of reliving their loved ones' final moments and learning details they might have preferred never to know. Throughout the legal proceedings and media coverage of this case, it became important to remember that Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick were more than just victims in a true crime story. They were young women with their own hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Rory Hatch, despite her struggles with homelessness and addiction, was someone's daughter, someone who mattered deeply to her family and friends. Her mother's fierce defense of her daughter's memory during the trial proceedings was a reminder that vulnerable people in our society are not disposable, even when their circumstances make them easy targets for predators. The fact that Rory was pregnant at the time of her death adds another dimension to the tragedy. She was carrying a child, representing hope for the future and the possibility of a different path forward in her life. That potential was brutally ended by Strong's actions. Candace Fitzpatrick had been just 19 when she vanished in 2008. For nearly 10 years, her family lived with the uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to her. While the discovery of her remains finally provided answers, it also confirmed their worst fears about her fate. Both women were young, at ages when they should have been looking forward to decades of life experiences, relationships, career opportunities, and personal growth. Instead, they became the victims of a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable young women, knowing that their marginalized status might make their disappearances less likely to generate immediate intensive investigation. The case of Adam Strong and his victims raises important questions about how society protects its most vulnerable members. Both Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick were young women dealing with circumstances that placed them at higher risk: homelessness, addiction, and the various challenges that come with being marginalized in society. Predators like Strong often specifically target individuals who they believe are less likely to be immediately missed or whose disappearances might not generate the same level of public attention or police resources as missing persons from more stable backgrounds. This targeting of vulnerable populations is a disturbing pattern seen in many serial killing cases. The nearly 10-year gap between Candace's murder in 2008 and Rory's murder in 2017 raises questions about whether Strong might have had other victims during this period. While no other cases were conclusively linked to him during the investigation and trial, the sophistication of his disposal method suggests someone with considerable experience in concealing evidence of violent crimes. The case also highlights the important role that routine maintenance and service work can play in uncovering hidden crimes. The plumber who discovered human remains in Strong's pipes was simply doing his job, but his professional integrity in immediately reporting what he found was crucial to bringing Strong to justice and providing answers to the families of both victims. The Strong case presented numerous challenges for investigators, not least of which was the condition and disposal method of the remains. When human remains are deliberately dismembered and dispersed through multiple disposal methods, some flushed down toilets, others stored in freezers, and still others disposed of in bodies of water, reconstructing what happened becomes an extraordinarily complex task. Forensic experts had to work with partial remains, degraded DNA samples, and evidence that had been deliberately compromised by the perpetrator. The fact that they were able to definitively link both victims to Strong's apartment and build a case strong enough for conviction speaks to the skill and dedication of the investigative team. The timeline of the investigation also presented challenges. Rory's torso was discovered in September 2017, but it wasn't until December that the connection to Strong's apartment was made through the plumber's discovery. This meant that crucial time had passed during which evidence might have been further compromised or disposed of. For Candace Fitzpatrick's case, investigators had to work backward from 2008, trying to reconstruct events that had occurred nearly a decade earlier. Physical evidence had degraded, witnesses' memories had faded, and the trail had grown cold over the intervening years. That they were still able to build a successful case for manslaughter demonstrates the persistence and skill of the investigative team. The case also required extensive coordination between multiple agencies and specialists, homicide detectives, forensic experts, DNA analysts, and various other professionals all working together to piece together the evidence and build the prosecution's case. The conviction and sentencing of Adam Strong represented justice for Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick, but it also marked the end of a long and painful journey for their families. The legal process, while necessary, required them to relive their losses repeatedly as evidence was presented and witnesses testified. For Rory's mother, Shannon Dion, the trial was an opportunity not just to see her daughter's killer brought to justice, but to ensure that Rory was remembered as more than just a victim. Her statements to the media emphasized that despite her daughter's struggles with homelessness and addiction, Rory was loved and valued. This humanization of victims is crucial in true crime cases, where the sensational nature of the crimes can sometimes overshadow the real people who suffered. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of treating missing persons cases seriously, regardless of the victim's circumstances. While both Rory and Candace were reported missing, their marginalized status may have affected the initial response to their disappearances. Society has a responsibility to protect all its members, particularly those who are most vulnerable. The discovery of Strong's crimes through a routine plumbing call also highlights how criminal activity can be hidden in plain sight for years. Strong was living in a residential neighborhood, interacting with landlords, neighbors, and service providers, all while committing and concealing serious crimes. This case demonstrates the importance of remaining vigilant and reporting suspicious activity to authorities. One of the most crucial aspects of this case was the forensic work that allowed investigators to identify victims and connect them to Adam Strong. The process began with the challenging task of identifying the torso found in Oshawa Harbor in September 2017. Without a head or other easily identifiable features, forensic experts had to rely on other methods to determine the victim's identity. DNA analysis would ultimately prove that the remains belonged to Rory Hatch, but this process took time and required comparison samples from family members. The discovery of additional remains in Strong's apartment provided more pieces of the puzzle, but also presented new challenges. The remains had been deliberately dismembered and some had been stored in freezing conditions, which can affect DNA preservation and analysis. Perhaps even more challenging was the identification of Candace Fitzpatrick's remains. With no body parts discovered outside of Strong's apartment and evidence degraded by nearly a decade, forensic experts had to work with minimal samples to establish her identity and link her death to Strong. The forensic team also had to piece together the timeline of events and determine the cause of death for both victims. For Rory, the evidence suggested she had been killed by repeated blows to the head with a hammer-like object while she was restrained. This evidence was crucial to the first-degree murder conviction, as it demonstrated premeditation and extreme brutality. The forensic analysis also revealed details about Strong's disposal methods. The discovery of human tissue in the plumbing system showed that he had been systematically disposing of human remains through the building's drainage system. Other remains had been stored in his freezer, while some had been disposed of in Lake Ontario. The revelation that a serial killer had been operating from a basement apartment in Oshawa for nearly a decade had a profound impact on the local community. Residents of the McMillan Drive area, in particular, had to grapple with the knowledge that such horrific crimes had been taking place in their neighborhood. The case also raised concerns about the safety of vulnerable populations in the community. Both victims had been young women dealing with challenging circumstances, and their murders highlighted the dangers faced by homeless individuals and those struggling with addiction. Local organizations working with vulnerable populations used the case as an opportunity to discuss safety measures and resources available to at-risk individuals. The tragedy served as a stark reminder of the need for comprehensive support systems for people experiencing homelessness and addiction. The investigation also had practical impacts on the community. The extensive police presence during the evidence collection phase, along with the ongoing court proceedings, kept the case in local headlines for several years. Community members served as witnesses, jurors, and in other capacities during the legal process. For many residents, the case shattered assumptions about safety and security in their community. The knowledge that such calculated and brutal crimes had been occurring undetected for years was deeply unsettling and led to increased awareness about reporting suspicious activity. The case also highlighted the importance of service workers and maintenance personnel in potentially uncovering hidden crimes. The plumber's discovery was instrumental in bringing Strong to justice, demonstrating how routine professional activities can sometimes reveal evidence of serious criminal activity. As we near the end of this tragic story, it's important to reflect on what we can learn from the case of Adam Strong and his victims. This case illustrates several important points about criminal investigation, victim advocacy, and community safety. First, it demonstrates the crucial importance of taking missing persons cases seriously, regardless of the victim's circumstances. Both Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick were vulnerable young women whose disappearances might not have generated the same immediate intensive response as missing persons from more stable backgrounds. However, their lives were equally valuable, and they deserved the same level of investigation and public attention. The case also shows how predators often specifically target vulnerable populations, knowing that these victims are less likely to be immediately missed and their cases less likely to generate sustained public attention. This targeting of marginalized individuals is a pattern seen in many serial crimes, and it underscores the need for society to provide better protection and support for at-risk populations. From an investigative standpoint, the case highlights the importance of forensic science and the dedication of professionals who work with limited and compromised evidence to seek justice for victims. The forensic experts, detectives, and other professionals who worked on this case faced significant challenges but persevered to build successful prosecutions against Strong. The discovery of the crimes through a routine plumbing call also illustrates how criminal activity can remain hidden in plain sight for years. Strong was living in a residential neighborhood, paying rent, and interacting with various service providers while committing and concealing serious crimes. This reminds us of the importance of remaining vigilant and reporting suspicious activity to authorities. As we conclude this story tonight, let us take a moment to remember Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as young women who had hopes, dreams, and people who loved them deeply. Rory, at 18, was still finding her way in the world. Despite facing challenges with homelessness and addiction, she was expecting a child and perhaps looking forward to a different future. Her mother's fierce advocacy during the trial proceedings reminded everyone that Rory was not defined by her struggles but by her inherent worth as a human being. Candace, who was 19 when she was killed in 2008, had her whole life ahead of her. For nearly 10 years, her family lived with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to her. While the discovery of her remains finally provided answers, it also confirmed their worst fears. Both young women deserved to live full lives, to experience love, achievement, and all the possibilities that come with being young. Instead, they encountered Adam Strong, a predator who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity for violence. The conviction and life sentence given to Strong represents justice, but it cannot restore what was taken from these families and from our community. What we can do is remember these young women, support vulnerable populations in our communities, and remain vigilant against those who would prey upon the marginalized. The case also reminds us of the dedicated professionals who work tirelessly to seek justice for victims, the detectives who investigated for years, the forensic experts who painstakingly analyzed degraded evidence, the prosecutors who built the case, and even the plumber whose integrity in reporting what he found was crucial to bringing Strong to justice. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that while there is darkness in the world, there are also people working every day to bring light to that darkness, to seek justice for victims, and to protect the vulnerable among us. And remember Rory and Candace, two young women whose lives mattered, whose stories deserve to be told, and whose memories deserve to be honored. Rest in peace, Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick. Your stories will not be forgotten. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. This story takes us to Federal Way, Washington, a suburban community south of Seattle where tree-lined streets and quiet neighborhoods typically offer residents a sense of safety and peace. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where children ride bicycles on sidewalks, and where the most exciting event might be the local farmers market on weekends. But in May 2022, this tranquil setting became the backdrop for a crime so shocking that it would shatter not only one family's world, but challenge everything investigators thought they knew about trust between roommates. This is the story of Richard Leviatz, a 41-year-old man whose life was cut tragically short in the most unimaginable way. It's a story about the thin line between normalcy and horror, about how darkness can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, and about a crime that would take investigators down a path they never expected to follow. Richard Leviatz was the kind of person who made life a little brighter for everyone around him. At 41, he had cultivated a life filled with simple pleasures and genuine connections. Those who knew him described a man with an infectious love for soccer, spending countless hours either playing the sport he'd loved since childhood or cheering on his favorite teams from the comfort of his living room. The walls of his Federal Way townhouse were decorated with soccer memorabilia, jerseys from different leagues, and photographs of himself on various fields throughout the years. But Richard's passions extended far beyond sports. He was a foodie in the truest sense, someone who found joy in discovering new restaurants, experimenting with recipes in his kitchen, and sharing meals with friends and family. His social media was filled with photos of elaborately plated dishes, both from his culinary adventures and his own cooking attempts. Friends often joked that Richard could find the best hole-in-the-wall restaurant in any city, and he wore that reputation as a badge of honor. Travel was another of Richard's great loves. He had spent years exploring different corners of the world, collecting experiences rather than material possessions. His apartment was filled with small souvenirs from his journeys, a ceramic plate from Spain, a carved wooden figure from Morocco, postcards from cities across Europe tucked into the edges of picture frames. Each item held a story, and Richard was always eager to share those stories with anyone who showed interest. Perhaps most importantly, Richard was known for his generous heart. Family members and friends consistently described him as someone who would drop everything to help others. He was the person friends called when they needed someone to listen, when they needed practical help, or simply when they wanted company. His relatives spoke of a man who remembered birthdays, who checked in during difficult times, and who had an uncanny ability to show up exactly when he was needed most. Richard had chosen to share his Federal Way townhouse with a roommate, a practical decision that many people in the Seattle area make given the rising cost of living. The arrangement seemed to work well initially, two adults sharing space, splitting bills, maintaining their own lives while coexisting peacefully under one roof. It was a common living situation, one that thousands of people navigate successfully every day. This roommate arrangement had brought Nicholas Van Cleve into Richard's life and home. Van Cleve, like Richard, was navigating the challenges of adult life in an expensive metropolitan area. On the surface, their cohabitation appeared unremarkable, two men sharing a living space, each pursuing their own routines and responsibilities. Nicholas Van Cleve seemed, by most outward appearances, to be an ordinary roommate. He paid his share of the bills, maintained his portion of the shared living spaces, and initially appeared to mesh well with Richard's easygoing personality. Like many roommate relationships, theirs was built on mutual convenience rather than deep friendship, but that didn't necessarily signal any problems. Millions of people share living spaces with acquaintances or strangers, creating functional domestic arrangements without developing close personal bonds. However, as spring 2022 progressed, subtle changes began to occur in the household dynamic. These changes were not immediately obvious to outsiders, and they developed gradually in the way that many domestic situations evolve, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly the atmosphere shifts entirely. One of the most significant changes came when Van Cleve brought home a gun. For Richard, this represented a fundamental shift in the character of their shared living space. The introduction of a firearm into their home was not something Richard had agreed to, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't necessarily unusual. Many people have strong feelings about guns in their homes, whether positive or negative, and it's the kind of issue that can create genuine tension between cohabitants. Richard's discomfort with the weapon was significant enough that he felt compelled to address it directly with Van Cleve. According to family members who later spoke with investigators, Richard had made his position clear. He wanted Van Cleve to remove the gun from their shared living space. When that didn't happen, Richard took the more dramatic step of asking Van Cleve to find other housing arrangements entirely. This was not a decision Richard made lightly. Asking a roommate to leave disrupts both people's living situations and financial arrangements. It suggests that Richard's discomfort had grown beyond what he felt he could tolerate. Family members who knew Richard well understood that for him to take such a definitive stance, the situation must have felt genuinely problematic to him. The timing of this confrontation would later prove to be tragically significant. Richard had given Van Cleve notice that he needed to move out, creating a deadline and a level of pressure that would soon escalate beyond anything either man could have anticipated. The final days of Richard Laviette's life unfolded during the first week of May 2022, as spring was settling into the Pacific Northwest. The weather was mild, the kind of pleasant early May days that make Seattle area residents remember why they love their region despite the long, gray winters. Trees were fully leafed out, flowers were blooming in neighborhood gardens, and there was that particular quality of light that comes with longer days and shorter nights. Richard was going about his normal routine during this time. He was working, maintaining his regular social connections, and handling the everyday business of adult life. From all external appearances, he was simply navigating the somewhat awkward situation of having given his roommate notice to move out, an uncomfortable domestic situation, but hardly the kind of thing that would typically signal impending danger. Van Cleve, meanwhile, was facing the practical realities of Richard's ultimatum. He needed to find new housing, arrange for the logistics of moving, and handle the financial implications of relocating. These are stressful circumstances under any conditions, but they represent the normal kinds of life challenges that adults face and work through all the time. What was happening in Van Cleve's mind during these days remains largely unknown. Investigators would later piece together the external facts of what occurred, but the internal psychological progression that led to violence remains murky. This is often the case in domestic homicides. The perpetrator's mental state in the days and hours leading up to the crime becomes a matter of speculation rather than certainty. What we do know is that sometime between May 1st and May 2nd, 2022, the tension in the Federal Way townhouse reached a breaking point. The exact sequence of events that led to violence may never be fully understood, but what followed would shock investigators, devastate Richard's family, and ultimately challenge everyone involved to understand how quickly and completely a living situation could deteriorate. May 2, 2022, started as an ordinary Monday for Richard's family members. They had their own routines, their own responsibilities, and their own expectations for how the day would unfold. Richard was typically good about staying in touch with his relatives. He was the kind of person who returned phone calls, who kept family informed about his life, and who maintained regular contact even during busy periods. When family members were unable to reach Richard, their initial concern was mild. People miss phone calls, get caught up in work or other activities, and sometimes simply forget to return messages. In our modern world of constant communication, it's easy to assume that temporary silence means nothing more than someone being busy or distracted. However, as the day progressed and Richard continued to be unreachable, his family's concern began to escalate. They knew his patterns, understood his typical responsiveness, and recognized when his silence felt genuinely unusual. Richard was not the type of person to simply disappear without explanation, especially not for extended periods. The decision to physically check on Richard was not made lightly. Going to someone's home unannounced represents a significant step, an acknowledgement that concern has moved beyond mild worry into genuine alarm. Family members understood that they might be overreacting, that they might arrive to find Richard simply having a busy day or dealing with some minor issue that had prevented him from responding to messages. When Richard's family members arrived at the Federal Way townhouse, they found a scene that initially appeared normal from the outside. The building looked unremarkable, the kind of multi-unit housing that dots suburban landscapes throughout the country. There were no obvious signs of disturbance, no indication that anything was amiss within the walls of what should have been Richard's safe haven. However, when they gained access to the residence, the horrible reality of what had occurred became immediately apparent. What they discovered inside the townhouse would haunt them for the rest of their lives and launch an investigation that would reveal the full scope of the violence that had taken place. Inside the residence, Richard's family found evidence of a crime so shocking that it challenged their ability to process what they were seeing. The scene was not just one of violence, but of deliberate, calculated action taken after that violence had occurred. What they discovered were 2 large garbage bags containing human remains, the dismembered body of Richard Lavietz. The call that came into the Federal Way Police Department on May 2, 2022, was the kind that changes the trajectory of every investigator involved. When family members discovered the human remains in Richard's townhouse, they immediately contacted emergency services, launching what would become one of the most disturbing homicide investigations the department had handled in recent memory. First responders arriving at the scene were confronted with evidence that immediately indicated this was no ordinary domestic dispute gone wrong. The presence of dismembered remains in garbage bags suggested a level of premeditation and calculated action that extended far beyond a momentary loss of control. This was not a crime of passion that ended when emotions cooled, it was a crime that continued long after the victim was dead. Detective teams began the painstaking process of securing and documenting the crime scene. Every room of the townhouse had to be examined, every surface potentially held evidence, and every item might provide crucial information about what had occurred and when. This kind of investigation requires meticulous attention to detail, as investigators work to reconstruct not just the moments of violence, but all the actions that followed. The initial examination of the remains provided investigators with their first concrete understanding of how Richard had died. The King County Medical Examiner's Office would later determine that Richard had been shot 5 times in the back of the head at close range. This finding was significant for several reasons. It indicated the deliberate, execution-style nature of the killing, and it suggested that Richard had been caught completely unaware of the danger he faced. Even more disturbing was the medical examiner's determination about what had happened after Richard's death. Medical examiners found that Lavietz's bones appeared fractured and cut, and determined that he was dismembered after he was killed. The forensic evidence also revealed that Richard had no defensive wounds, indicating he was unable to fight back. These findings painted a picture of a calculated, cold-blooded killing followed by extensive efforts to conceal the crime. The dismemberment was not the result of frenzied violence, but rather a deliberate attempt to dispose of evidence and hide what had been done. As investigators continued processing the scene, they discovered additional evidence that would prove crucial to understanding the case. During a search of the townhouse, police found a handgun, a knife, a hatchet, and other evidence. This collection of weapons suggested both the means by which the crime had been committed and the tools used in its aftermath. The investigation quickly focused on Nicholas Van Cleve, Richard's roommate, who was notably absent from the scene when the body was discovered. His disappearance in the immediate aftermath of the discovery raised obvious questions about his potential involvement in Richard's death. As investigators worked to locate Nicholas Van Cleve, they were simultaneously building a case based on the evidence found at the crime scene and the information gathered from Richard's family members. The picture that emerged was of a domestic living situation that had deteriorated rapidly in the days before Richard's death. Family members told detectives that Richard had told Van Cleve he needed to move out after Van Cleve brought the gun home. This information provided investigators with a potential motive for the killing, the conflict over the firearm and the ultimatum that Richard had issued about Van Cleve finding new housing. When Van Cleve was located and arrested, he was charged with premeditated first-degree murder. The premeditation aspect of the charge was significant, indicating that prosecutors believed Van Cleve had planned Richard's death rather than acting in a moment of uncontrolled anger. The evidence supporting this interpretation included the execution-style nature of the shooting and the extensive efforts made to conceal the crime afterward. The charging documents revealed the full scope of what prosecutors believed had occurred. Van Cleve allegedly shot his 41-year-old roommate 5 times in the back of the head sometime between May 1 to 2, 2022, and then took extensive and extreme steps to hide the crime, including dismembering the body. The case that prosecutors built against Van Cleve was based not only on the physical evidence found at the scene, but also on the circumstantial evidence surrounding the deteriorating roommate relationship and Van Cleve's actions in the aftermath of the killing. The combination of forensic evidence, witness statements, and Van Cleve's behavior created what prosecutors felt was a compelling case for premeditated murder. For Richard's family, the discovery of his remains and the subsequent investigation represented a trauma that extended far beyond the simple fact of his death. The manner of his killing, shot in the back of the head while unaware of the danger he faced, suggested a profound betrayal of trust by someone who had shared his living space and his daily life. The dismemberment of Richard's body added another layer of horror to an already devastating situation. For family members who had known Richard as a vibrant, loving person, the clinical details of how his body had been treated after death represented an almost incomprehensible violation of his dignity and humanity. The investigation process itself became another source of trauma for Richard's loved ones. Homicide investigations, particularly those involving such graphic evidence, require family members to confront details about their loved one's final moments that no one should have to bear. Every court hearing, every piece of evidence, every discussion with prosecutors served as a reminder of the violence that had ended Richard's life. For the Federal Way community, the case raised uncomfortable questions about the people we invite into our lives and homes. Richard's decision to share his living space with Van Cleve was a practical one made by countless people facing housing costs in expensive metropolitan areas. The idea that such an arrangement could lead to such violence challenged residents' assumptions about the safety of their own domestic situations. The case against Nicholas Van Cleve moved through the King County court system as a capital murder prosecution, reflecting both the serious nature of the charges and the calculated way in which the crime had been carried out. Premeditated first-degree murder charges in Washington state carry the possibility of life in prison without the possibility of parole, indicating the gravity with which the legal system viewed Van Cleve's alleged actions. As the case progressed through pretrial motions and legal proceedings, the full scope of the evidence against Van Cleve became clearer. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the forensic evidence found at the crime scene, the testimony of Richard's family members about the deteriorating roommate relationship, and the circumstantial evidence surrounding Van Cleve's behavior before and after the killing. The defense faced the challenging task of addressing both the physical evidence linking Van Cleve to the crime and the particularly disturbing nature of the post-mortem dismemberment. In cases involving such graphic evidence, defense attorneys must navigate between challenging the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence while not appearing to minimize the severity of what occurred. However, the case took an unexpected turn that would ultimately change everything about the prosecution's efforts to hold Van Cleve accountable for Richard's death. In a development that shocked both Richard's family and the broader community that had followed the case against Nicholas Van Cleve was ultimately dismissed. This dismissal came in April 2025, nearly 3 years after Richard's death and after extensive legal proceedings had been ongoing. The dismissal of such a serious case, particularly one with what appeared to be substantial physical evidence, raised questions about the legal process and the challenges of prosecuting complex homicide cases. While the specific reasons for the dismissal were not detailed in public reporting, such outcomes in murder cases typically result from issues with evidence, procedural problems, or other legal complications that undermine the prosecution's ability to proceed. For Richard's family, the dismissal represented another layer of trauma in what had already been an impossibly difficult journey. After enduring the initial shock of Richard's death, the horror of discovering the circumstances of his killing, and the long process of legal proceedings, they were left without the resolution that a trial and conviction might have provided. The dismissal also left broader questions unanswered about exactly what had occurred in that Federal Way townhouse during the first days of May 2022. While the physical evidence clearly indicated that Richard had been killed and dismembered, the legal system's inability to successfully prosecute Van Cleve meant that many details about the crime would likely never be fully explored in a courtroom setting. The murder of Richard Lavietz forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of trust and safety in our daily lives. Richard made what seemed like a reasonable decision to share his living space with another adult, a choice motivated by practical concerns and executed with apparent care and consideration. The arrangement had worked successfully for a period of time, suggesting that there were no obvious warning signs of the violence that was to come. The deterioration of the roommate relationship over the presence of a firearm in their shared home represents the kind of domestic disagreement that many people navigate without resorting to violence. Roommates disagree about pets, guests, cleanliness, noise levels, and countless other aspects of shared living. The vast majority of these disagreements are resolved through discussion, compromise, or one party choosing to find alternative housing arrangements. Richard's decision to ask Van Cleve to move out was a reasonable response to feeling uncomfortable with a gun in his home. It represented an attempt to establish boundaries and maintain his own sense of safety and security in his living environment. That this reasonable request apparently triggered such an extreme response highlights the unpredictability of human behavior and the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath seemingly normal interpersonal relationships. The case also raises questions about how well we really know the people with whom we share our most intimate spaces. Van Cleve had lived in Richard's home, shared meals, presumably engaged in the everyday interactions that characterize roommate relationships. Yet ultimately, he was capable of killing Richard in cold blood and then taking extensive steps to conceal his crime. This disconnect between the person Richard thought he knew and the person who ultimately killed him represents one of the most disturbing aspects of domestic violence cases. Federal Way, like many suburban communities, operates on assumptions of safety and predictability. Residents expect that their neighbors are who they appear to be, that domestic disputes will be resolved through conventional means, and that the most serious crimes are things that happen elsewhere, to other people, under different circumstances. The murder of Richard Lavietz challenged all of these assumptions. Here was a man who had been living a quiet, unremarkable life in a typical residential setting, killed by someone who had shared his daily routine and living space. The crime occurred not in some distant, dangerous location, but in the kind of townhouse complex where many residents lived themselves. For Richard's neighbors, the knowledge of what had occurred just doors away from their own homes forced a reconsideration of their own safety and the people around them. The realization that such violence could unfold so close to their own lives, involving people who had seemed so ordinary, created a lasting impact on the community's sense of security. Local law enforcement also faced questions about domestic violence prevention and recognition. While there were no reports of prior incidents between Richard and Van Cleve, the case highlighted the challenges of identifying potentially dangerous domestic situations before they escalate to violence. The tragedy of Richard Lavietz's death offers limited lessons for prevention, which is itself part of what makes the case so disturbing. Richard appeared to have handled the conflict with his roommate in a reasonable, measured way. He expressed his discomfort with the firearm, he set clear boundaries about what he would and would not accept in his living situation, and he took decisive action by asking Van Cleve to find alternative housing. These were appropriate responses to a domestic disagreement, the kind of conflict resolution that relationship experts and safety advocates typically recommend. Richard was not ignoring warning signs or failing to advocate for his own comfort and safety. He was, by all accounts, handling a difficult situation in exactly the way that most people would recommend. This makes his death particularly tragic because it suggests that even reasonable, appropriate responses to domestic conflict cannot always prevent violence. Sometimes, despite our best efforts to navigate interpersonal relationships safely and responsibly, we encounter people whose response to conflict extends far beyond what any rational person would anticipate. For others facing similar domestic conflicts, Richard's case offers both sobering realities and important reminders. The presence of firearms in domestic situations can escalate conflicts in unpredictable ways, and disagreements about weapons in shared living spaces represent the kind of fundamental incompatibility that may be difficult to resolve through compromise. The case also underscores the importance of trusting our instincts about safety and being willing to make difficult decisions when living situations feel uncomfortable or threatening. Richard's decision to ask Van Cleve to move out was exactly the kind of boundary setting that safety experts recommend, even though in this case it may have inadvertently triggered the violence that followed. In the aftermath of this terrible crime, it becomes important to remember Richard Leviatz not as a victim of violence, but as a person who lived a full, meaningful life filled with relationships, interests, and contributions to his community. The way he died does not define who he was, even though it has inevitably become the lens through which many people know his story. Richard was a person who brought joy to others through his enthusiasm for soccer, his adventures in food and travel, and his generous spirit toward friends and family. He was someone who maintained connections across time and distance, who showed up for people when they needed support, and who approached life with curiosity and openness. His decision to share his home with a roommate reflected his practical approach to life's challenges and his willingness to build connections with others. That this openness ultimately made him vulnerable to violence speaks to the broader tragedy of his death, that someone who approached relationships with trust and generosity encountered someone who was capable of betraying that trust in the most fundamental way possible. The dismissal of charges against Van Cleve means that Richard's family will never see legal justice for his death, but it does not diminish the impact that Richard had on the people who knew and loved him. His memory lives on in the stories shared by friends and family, in the places he visited, in the meals he shared, and in the countless small ways that he made life better for the people around him. The murder of Richard Leviatz remains a stark reminder of how quickly and completely our assumptions about safety and normalcy can be shattered. In a world where millions of people successfully navigate shared living arrangements, domestic disagreements, and interpersonal conflicts, his case represents a tragic exception that challenges our understanding of human behavior and the hidden potential for violence that can exist in seemingly ordinary relationships. The case also highlights the complexities of the criminal justice system and the challenges of prosecuting violent crimes, even when there appears to be substantial physical evidence. The ultimate dismissal of charges against Nicholas Van Cleve leaves many questions unanswered and denies Richard's family the closure that a successful prosecution might have provided. For those of us who follow true crime stories, Richard's case serves as a reminder that behind every case file and court proceeding is a real person whose life was cut short, whose family and friends continue to grieve, and whose story deserves to be remembered with dignity and respect. The details of how Richard died may be what brought his case to public attention, but the details of how he lived, with generosity, curiosity, and love for the people around him, are what should ultimately define his legacy. In the quiet suburban streets of Federal Way, Washington, life continues much as it did before May 2022. Neighbors still share friendly greetings, roommates still navigate the complexities of shared living spaces, and people still make practical decisions about housing and domestic arrangements. But for those who knew Richard Leviatz, and for the community that was shocked by his death, there remains the sobering knowledge of how fragile our sense of safety can be, and how important it is to cherish the people we love while we have the chance to do so. The story of Richard Leviatz is ultimately a story about the preciousness of ordinary life, the simple joys of good food, favorite sports teams, travel adventures, and time spent with family and friends. These are the things that made Richard's life meaningful, and these are the things that his death reminds us to value in our own lives and relationships. As we reflect on this tragic case, we're left not with easy answers or clear lessons, but with the more complex understanding that safety and danger, normalcy and violence, trust and betrayal can exist much closer together than we typically imagine. Richard's story challenges us to hold both realities simultaneously, to remain open to connection and community while staying alert to the signs that something might not be as it appears. Tonight, as Federal Way settles into quiet evening routines, as roommates across the country navigate their own domestic arrangements, and as families everywhere check in with loved ones, Richard Laviette's story serves as both a caution and a call to appreciate the ordinary moments of connection and care that define our daily lives. In a world where such violence is possible, these moments of genuine human connection become not just precious, but essential to our understanding of what makes life worth living. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Let me tell you about a story that unfolded in one of California's most beautiful regions, where rolling hills dotted with grapevines stretch as far as the eye can see, and where the morning mist creates an almost ethereal landscape. This is Napa Valley, a place known for its world-renowned wineries, its temperate climate, and most importantly for our story, its reputation as one of the safest communities in Northern California. It was here, in this tranquil corner of wine country, that three young women had chosen to make their home together. Their names were Leslie and Matsara, Adrian Insogna, and Lauren Mianza, three friends in their mid-20s, each pursuing their own dreams and ambitions, sharing a modest three-bedroom house on Dorset Street that would become the center of one of Napa's most shocking crimes. Leslie Ann Matsara was 26 years old, a woman whose life had been marked by both beauty and determination. She had once held the title of Miss South Carolina, her radiant smile and poise having earned her recognition in pageant circles. But Leslie was far more than just a pretty face. After her pageant days, she had made the decision to move to Napa Valley to start fresh, drawn by the area's charm and the opportunity to be closer to her mother. She was working to establish herself professionally, navigating the transition from her former life in the South to this new chapter in California's wine country. Adrian Insogna, also 26, was the practical one of the group, an engineer whose sharp mind and technical skills had earned her respect in a field still dominated by men. Adrian had always been drawn to building and creating, finding satisfaction in solving complex problems and turning ideas into reality. But life hadn't always been kind to Adrian. At the age of 16, she had survived a devastating car accident that should have killed her. Her car had rolled at least 3 times, and each time it rolled, Adrian's head struck the pavement through the open window. The doctors had called her survival a miracle, and perhaps that brush with mortality had made her appreciate life all the more. The third roommate was Lauren Mianza, 27 years old, a volleyball coach who brought an athletic energy to their household. Lauren's bedroom was located on the lower floor of their home, while Leslie and Adrian had chosen rooms upstairs. This seemingly minor detail about the layout of their house would prove to be the difference between life and death on that fateful Halloween night in 2004. The three women had developed a genuine friendship, the kind that comes from sharing daily life, cooking meals together, watching movies, talking about their hopes and fears late into the evening. Their house was filled with laughter and the comfortable chaos of young women making their way in the world. They felt safe in their neighborhood, safe in their community, and safe in the bonds they had formed with each other. October 31, 2004, had been a typical Halloween evening in Napa. The weather was mild, perfect for trick-or-treaters making their rounds through the well-manicured neighborhoods. Children in costumes had knocked on doors throughout the evening, their parents trailing behind with flashlights and candy bags. By the time the last of the Halloween festivities wound down, most of Napa Valley had settled in for the night. At the house on Dorset Street, the three roommates had spent a quiet evening at home. There was nothing unusual about their routine, no parties, no late-night visitors, nothing that would have suggested the horror that was about to unfold. Leslie and Adrian had retired to their upstairs bedrooms, while Lauren settled into her room on the lower floor. The house grew quiet as each woman drifted toward sleep, secure in their belief that they were safe in their home, in their neighborhood, in their lives. Lauren Mianza had always been a light sleeper, a trait that came from years of being responsible for others as a coach. Even in deep sleep, part of her mind remained alert, ready to respond to any unusual sound or disturbance. This natural vigilance, which might have seemed like a minor character trait, would prove to be the thing that saved her life. It was after midnight when Lauren was awakened by the sound of her dog growling, a low, menacing sound that immediately put her on edge. Dogs, she knew, didn't growl at nothing. There was something in the house that shouldn't be there, something that had triggered her pet's protective instincts. As she lay in bed, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, she became aware of other sounds coming from upstairs. At first, the sounds seemed almost mundane: footsteps, the creaking of floorboards, what sounded like furniture being moved. Lauren's first thought was that one of her roommates must have had a visitor, perhaps someone they had met during the Halloween evening. The rhythmic thumping sounds that followed seemed to confirm this theory. To Lauren's sleepy mind, it sounded like a bed hitting against the wall, the kind of noise that roommates learn to politely ignore. But then came the scream. It was a sound unlike anything Lauren had ever heard, a cry of pure terror that cut through the night air and sent ice through her veins. The scream was followed by another, equally terrified, equally desperate. These weren't the sounds of passion or play. These were the sounds of people in mortal danger. Lauren's athletic training kicked in, her body responding before her mind had fully processed what she was hearing. She knew, with the certainty that comes from pure instinct, that something terrible was happening upstairs. But she also knew that rushing blindly toward danger wouldn't help anyone. She needed to be smart, to be careful, to think clearly despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. What happened next would haunt Lauren Mianza for the rest of her life, but it would also save it. Despite every instinct telling her to run to her friend's aid, despite the loyalty she felt toward Leslie and Adrian, Lauren made the decision to investigate cautiously. She crept toward the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breathing shallow and quick. As she approached the staircase, she could hear footsteps above, heavy, deliberate footsteps that didn't match the lighter steps of her roommates. Someone else was in the house, someone who didn't belong there. And as Lauren stood at the bottom of the stairs, straining to hear what was happening above, those footsteps began moving in her direction. The sound of someone coming down the stairs toward her galvanized Lauren into action. This wasn't the time for heroics or investigation. This was the time to run. She turned and fled from the house, not stopping until she reached her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her voice barely steady enough to give the dispatcher the information they needed. The police response was swift. Within minutes, squad cars were pulling up to the house on Dorset Street, their red and blue lights painting the quiet neighborhood in an eerie glow. Officers approached the house with weapons drawn, not knowing what they would find inside, not knowing if the perpetrator was still there or had vanished into the night. What the first officers on the scene discovered would become one of the most brutal crime scenes in Napa Valley's history. The killer had gained entry through a kitchen window, forcing it open with a violence that spoke to desperate determination. From there, he had made his way upstairs, where Leslie and Adrian had been sleeping peacefully in their beds. The attack had been savage and sustained. Both women had been stabbed repeatedly, their beds soaked with blood that pooled on the floor in quantities that investigators would later describe as being inches deep. The sheer volume of blood at the scene painted a picture of a prolonged and vicious assault, one that spoke to rage rather than simple robbery or burglary gone wrong. What puzzled investigators from the very beginning was the apparent randomness of the attack. Nothing had been stolen from the house. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The killer had focused exclusively on the two women upstairs, never bothering to search the lower level where Lauren had been sleeping. It was as if he had known exactly where to find his targets, or as if his rage had been so consuming that everything else became irrelevant. The crime scene told a story of violence, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Why had these two young women been targeted? Why had the killer spared Lauren, who was sleeping just downstairs? And perhaps most troubling of all, who could have harbored such rage against two women who, by all accounts, lived quiet, peaceful lives? The investigation into the murders of Leslie Matsara and Adrian Insogna began immediately, but it would prove to be one of the most challenging cases in Napa County's history. The crime appeared random, senseless, without the usual motives that investigators rely on to build their cases. There was no evidence of robbery, no signs of sexual assault, no obvious connection between the victims and their killer. Detectives began the painstaking process of reconstructing the last days and weeks of Leslie's and Adrian's lives. They interviewed friends, family members, co-workers, anyone who might have insight into potential threats or conflicts. They examined the women's social circles, their work relationships, their romantic histories. They looked into their finances, their online activities, their daily routines. What emerged from this investigation was a picture of two young women living ordinary, law-abiding lives. Leslie was working to establish herself professionally after her move to Napa, focusing on building a new life in a new place. Adrian was dedicated to her engineering career, respected by her colleagues and supervisors. Neither woman had enemies, neither had been involved in conflicts that would suggest a motive for murder. The physical evidence from the crime scene was limited. The killer had been careful not to leave obvious traces of his identity. There were no fingerprints that didn't belong to the residents of the house. DNA evidence would take time to process, and even then, it would only be useful if the killer was already in the system or could be identified through other means. As days turned into weeks without an arrest, fear began to spread through the Napa Valley community. This was a place where people were accustomed to leaving their doors unlocked, where children played outside until dark, where the biggest concerns were typically related to traffic during harvest season or tourism. The brutal murders of two young women in their own home shattered that sense of security. Hardware stores reported a surge in sales of security equipment, deadbolts, security cameras, motion sensor lights. Women who had previously felt comfortable walking alone began traveling in groups. Parents who had allowed their teenagers considerable freedom began imposing earlier curfews and stricter check-in requirements. The investigation continued, but leads were scarce. Police followed up on tips from the public, investigated potential connections to other crimes in the region, and worked with federal authorities to examine the possibility that the killer might have struck elsewhere. But each avenue of investigation seemed to lead to a dead end. Meanwhile, Lauren Mianza was trying to rebuild her life while living with the survivor's guilt that came from being the one who had escaped. She had moved out of the house on Dorset Street immediately after the murders, unable to return to the place where her friends had died. She struggled with nightmares, with anxiety, with the constant fear that the killer might return to finish what he had started. The break in the case came from an unexpected source and in a way that would prove how sometimes the most complex investigations are solved through simple human connections rather than sophisticated forensic science. Almost a year after the murders, investigators received information about a man named Eric Koppel, a 25-year-old who had been struggling with personal problems in the months leading up to the Halloween night attack. Eric Koppel was not a name that had appeared in the early phases of the investigation. He wasn't an obvious suspect, wasn't someone who had been on the radar of law enforcement. He was a seemingly ordinary young man who worked installing home security systems, a detail that would later seem grimly ironic given the nature of his crimes. But Koppel had connections to the case that investigators had initially missed. He had been engaged to a woman named Lily Prudhomme, a county contractor who had worked with one of the victims. The engagement had ended before the murders, leaving Koppel devastated and struggling with depression and anger. This breakup, investigators would later learn, had sent Koppel into a downward spiral that culminated in the brutal attack on Dorset Street. The connection was tenuous at first, a broken engagement to someone who knew the victims. But as investigators dug deeper into Koppel's life and mental state in the months leading up to the murders, a picture began to emerge of a man whose personal pain had transformed into something darker and more dangerous. When police approached Eric Koppel for questioning in September 2005, nearly a year after the murders, he initially maintained his innocence. But the weight of the investigation, combined with his own guilt and the psychological pressure of having carried this secret for almost 12 months, began to take its toll. Koppel's behavior during questioning revealed a man who was struggling with the magnitude of what he had done. He was no hardened criminal, no experienced killer who could maintain his composure under interrogation. He was a young man who had committed an unthinkable act in a moment of rage and had been living with the consequences ever since. The details that emerged during his confession painted a picture of a crime that was both random and deeply personal. Koppel's anger over his broken engagement had festered and grown, transforming into a generalized rage that sought an outlet. On Halloween night, under the influence of alcohol and consumed by his emotional turmoil, he had made the decision to break into a house where he knew he would find victims. The fact that he chose the house on Dorset Street appeared to be connected to his knowledge of the residents through his former fiancée's social and professional connections. But the specific choice of Leslie and Adrian as victims seemed to be more a matter of cruel chance than deliberate targeting. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when Eric Koppel's psychological state reached its breaking point. Eric Koppel's confession to the murders of Leslie Matsara and Adrian Insogna revealed the senseless nature of their deaths. He had been drinking heavily on Halloween night, his emotional state already fragile from the end of his engagement and his struggles with depression and anger. The alcohol had lowered his inhibitions and amplified his rage, creating a perfect storm of psychological instability. His decision to break into the house on Dorset Street was not carefully planned or premeditated in the traditional sense. Instead, it was the culmination of months of emotional turmoil that had reached a boiling point. The fact that he knew of the house and its residents through social connections made it a target, but the brutal nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that went far beyond any rational motive. Koppel described entering through the kitchen window, making his way upstairs, and attacking the two women in their beds. His account of the murders was disturbing in its lack of clear motive or reasoning. He couldn't fully explain why he had chosen to kill Leslie and Adrian, couldn't articulate what he hoped to accomplish through their deaths. It was, in his own words, an act born of anger and alcohol, a moment of violence that destroyed multiple lives in a matter of minutes. Perhaps most troubling was Koppel's admission that he had no prior relationship with either victim. Leslie and Adrian had died not because of anything they had done, not because of any conflict or dispute, but simply because they had been accessible to a man whose psychological state had deteriorated to the point where violence seemed like an acceptable response to his personal pain. Throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, Lauren Mianza had to relive that terrible night over and over again. She testified about the sounds she had heard, the decisions she had made, the terror she had felt as she realized that something unspeakable was happening to her friends. Her testimony was crucial to establishing the timeline of events and the circumstances of the murders. But beyond her role as a witness, Lauren was also a victim, the survivor who had to find a way to continue living after experiencing something that most people could never imagine. She dealt with survivor's guilt, wondering if there was something more she could have done to save Leslie and Adrian. She struggled with fear, knowing that she had been only minutes and a few feet away from becoming a victim herself. The randomness of her survival haunted her. Why had the killer focused only on the upstairs bedrooms? Why hadn't he searched the entire house? These questions, which might seem minor in the context of the larger investigation, were central to Lauren's ability to process her experience and find a way to move forward. In many ways, Lauren's survival and her testimony were essential to bringing Eric Koppel to justice. Without her account of that night, investigators might never have understood the full scope of what had happened in the house on Dorset Street. Her courage in facing her attacker in court, in describing the sounds of her friend's final moments, helped ensure that justice would be served. The trial of Eric Koppel was relatively straightforward given his confession, but it still required the painful process of examining every detail of the crime. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose personal problems had escalated into homicidal rage, while the defense attempted to argue for mitigating circumstances related to Koppel's mental state and alcohol consumption. The evidence presented at trial revealed the full horror of what Leslie and Adrian had endured in their final moments. The medical examiner testified about the nature and extent of their injuries, confirming that both women had suffered multiple stab wounds and had fought desperately for their lives. The crime scene photographs, while too graphic for public viewing, provided stark evidence of the brutality of the attack. Koppel's confession was played for the jury, his voice describing the events of that Halloween night in terms that were both matter-of-fact and deeply disturbing. There was no glory in his account, no attempt to justify or romanticize what he had done. Instead, his words painted a picture of a man who had lost control completely and had destroyed lives, including his own, in a moment of unthinkable violence. The defense's attempts to argue for mitigation based on Koppel's mental state and alcohol consumption were largely unsuccessful. While the court acknowledged that Koppel had been struggling with personal problems, these factors were not considered sufficient to excuse or significantly reduce the severity of his crimes. The premeditated nature of breaking into the house, combined with the sustained violence of the attack, spoke to a level of criminal responsibility that could not be diminished by claims of temporary impairment. On the day of his sentencing, Eric Koppel faced the families of his victims and the community he had terrorized. The impact statements from Leslie's and Adrian's families were heartbreaking accounts of lives cut short and futures stolen. They spoke of young women who had been just beginning to discover who they would become, whose potential had been extinguished by a moment of senseless violence. Leslie's family remembered her beauty, both inner and outer, and her determination to build a new life in California. They spoke of plans she had made, dreams she had harbored, relationships she would never have the chance to develop. Her mother, who had been looking forward to having her daughter closer to home, now faced the reality that Leslie would never again call to share the details of her day or visit for holiday gatherings. Adrian's family spoke of her intelligence, her engineering skills, and her resilience. They recalled how she had survived that near-fatal car accident at 16, only to have her life ended by human violence at 26. They talked about projects she had been working on, problems she had been solving, the contributions she might have made to her field if she had been given the chance to grow and develop in her career. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, acknowledged the senseless nature of the crimes and the devastating impact they had had on the victims' families and the broader community. Eric Koppel was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. At the age of 26, the same age as his victims, Koppel began serving his sentence at Pleasant Valley State Prison in Coalinga, California. The irony was not lost on observers that he would spend the rest of his life in confinement, while Leslie and Adrian would remain forever young, forever 26, their lives ended just as they were beginning to truly flourish. Even after Eric Koppel's conviction and sentencing, questions remained about the nature of his crimes and what might have prevented them. Mental health professionals studied his case, trying to understand how personal disappointment and depression could escalate into homicidal violence. Law enforcement examined whether there were warning signs that might have been recognized and acted upon. The case highlighted the unpredictable nature of violence and the way that mental health crises can sometimes manifest in ways that endanger others. Koppel had no prior history of violent crime, no previous arrests for domestic violence or assault. He was not someone who would have appeared on law enforcement's radar as a potential threat. This randomness made the case particularly troubling for the Napa Valley community. It's one thing to live with the knowledge that criminals exist and might pose a threat, it's quite another to realize that someone with no criminal history, someone who seemed to be living an ordinary life, could suddenly become capable of such extreme violence. The case also raised questions about the connections between the victims and their killer. While Koppel had tenuous social connections to the women he murdered, these connections were so distant and indirect that they provided little insight into why he chose them as targets. In many ways, Leslie and Adrian had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Eric Koppel's psychological crisis reached its violent conclusion. Today, more than 20 years after that terrible Halloween night, the murders of Leslie Matsara and Adrian Insogna continue to resonate in the Napa Valley community. The case is remembered not only for its brutality but also for the way it shattered the community's sense of security and forced residents to confront the reality that violence can strike anywhere, at any time, without warning. For Lauren Mianza, the survivor, the case represents a defining moment that changed the trajectory of her entire life. She has had to find ways to honor the memory of her friends while also building a life for herself that isn't entirely defined by that night of terror. The strength she showed in fleeing the house and calling for help, and later in testifying against their killer, stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of unthinkable tragedy. The families of Leslie and Adrian have worked to ensure that their daughters are remembered not just as victims of a senseless crime, but as the vibrant, ambitious young women they were. Leslie's beauty and determination, Adrian's intelligence and engineering skills, these qualities that defined them in life continue to be celebrated by those who loved them. In the broader context of criminal justice, the case serves as an example of how modern investigative techniques, combined with traditional detective work and sometimes simple human connections, can eventually solve even the most puzzling crimes. The investigation that led to Eric Koppel's arrest and conviction required patience, persistence, and the ability to follow leads that might have seemed insignificant at first glance. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to remember that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives were forever changed by violence. Leslie and Matsara and Adrian Insogna were not just victims to be discussed and analyzed, they were daughters, friends, colleagues, and dreamers whose stories were cut short by one man's inability to cope with his personal problems in a healthy way. Their story reminds us of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing the relationships we have with the people around us. It also serves as a stark reminder that evil can sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places, and that our safety often depends on factors beyond our control. Lauren Mianza's survival and courage in the aftermath of the murders provide a counterpoint to the darkness of the crime itself. Her decision to flee rather than confront the killer directly, her quick thinking in calling for help, and her strength in testifying at trial all demonstrate the power of human resilience and the importance of bearing witness to truth, even when that truth is painful to confront. The case of the Napa Halloween murders will likely continue to be studied and discussed by criminologists, legal professionals, and true crime enthusiasts for years to come. But beyond its value as a case study in criminal behavior and investigation, it remains, at its heart, a tragedy, a story of lives lost too soon and dreams that will never be fulfilled. Eric Koppel remains in prison, serving his life sentence and living with the consequences of his actions on that Halloween night in 2004. His victims, Leslie and Adrian, remain forever young in the memories of those who loved them, their stories serving as a reminder of both the beauty and the fragility of human life. And in the quiet wine country of Napa Valley, where the morning mist still rolls across the vineyards and the seasons continue their ancient cycle, the community continues to heal from wounds that may never fully close, carrying forward the memory of two bright lights that were extinguished too soon on a night when Halloween became a true nightmare. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet suburbs of Melvindale, Michigan, autumn leaves were beginning their gentle descent in late September 2018. The air carried that familiar crispness that signals summer's end, and Friday night lights illuminated high school football fields across the Detroit metropolitan area. For 39-year-old David Carter, this should have been just another evening watching his teenage son play football, surrounded by the comfortable routines of suburban family life. Instead, it would be the last time his loved ones would see him alive. This is the story of a devoted father whose life was cut tragically short, a mystery that spans 2 states, and a woman who vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a trail of evidence that would shock even seasoned investigators. It's a case that demonstrates how quickly normalcy can shatter, and how someone we think we know can harbor the darkest of secrets. David Carter was the kind of man whose presence filled a room with warmth and easy laughter. Standing tall with an infectious smile, he had built a life centered around the two things that mattered most to him, his family and his community. Those who knew David would tell you he was more than just a father, he was a mentor, a friend, and someone you could count on when life got complicated. By day, David worked at the Magna Seating Plant, an automotive manufacturing facility that served the Detroit area's thriving car industry. It was steady work, the kind of job that provided stability and allowed him to support his family. But David's ambition stretched beyond the factory floor. In his spare time, he had started a clothing line called Lavish Habits Unlimited, pouring his creativity and entrepreneurial spirit into designs that reflected his personality, bold, optimistic, and distinctly his own. The clothing business was more than just a side hustle for David, it represented his dreams and his desire to leave something meaningful behind for his children. He would spend evenings sketching designs, researching suppliers, and building the foundation of what he hoped would become a successful brand. Friends remember him talking excitedly about his plans, always with that characteristic enthusiasm that made you believe he could accomplish anything he set his mind to. But perhaps David's most cherished role was as a volunteer with the Melvindale Junior Football League. Every week, you could find him on the sidelines, cheering not just for his own son but for every young player who needed encouragement. He understood that sports were about more than winning and losing, they were about building character, learning teamwork, and having a positive male role model in your life. The other coaches and parents knew David as someone who genuinely cared about the kids. He would arrive early to help set up equipment and stay late to make sure everything was cleaned up properly. When a family couldn't afford equipment for their child, David would quietly find a way to help. When a player was struggling with confidence, David was there with words of encouragement and patient instruction. His home in the Gale Gardens apartments reflected his priorities. The modest dwelling was filled with photos of his children, mementos from football seasons, and samples from his clothing line. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home, a place where his children felt safe and loved, where friends were always welcome, and where David could pursue his dreams while staying grounded in what truly mattered. Those closest to David knew he had been through his share of heartbreak. Relationships had come and gone, and as a single father, he carried the weight of providing both emotional and financial support for his children. But he never complained, never let bitterness take root. Instead, he approached each new day with optimism and each new relationship with hope. This was the man who, in early 2018, had begun dating Tammy Williams. To those around him, it seemed like David was ready to open his heart again, to perhaps find the kind of partnership that could complement the life he had worked so hard to build. Tammy Williams entered David Carter's life like many modern relationships begin, through the ordinary channels of contemporary dating. She was an attractive woman in her early 40s, articulate and seemingly put together. With a background in the travel industry, she projected an image of someone who was worldly, sophisticated, and ready for a serious relationship. To David's friends and family, Tammy seemed like a breath of fresh air in his life. She was attentive and interested in his dreams, supportive of his clothing business, and appeared to understand the demands of dating a single father. She would attend family gatherings, show up at his son's football games, and integrate herself into the social circles that mattered to David. But relationships, especially new ones, often exist in a carefully curated bubble. The version of ourselves we present in those early months of dating can be quite different from who we are behind closed doors. Tammy Williams was particularly skilled at maintaining this facade, presenting herself as stable, loving, and genuinely interested in building a future with David. By September 2018, David and Tammy had been together for 6 months, long enough for the initial excitement to settle into something that felt more substantial, but not long enough for all the layers to be fully peeled back. To David, it must have felt like his patience in love was finally paying off. Here was someone who seemed to appreciate not just him, but the life he had built and the values he held dear. The travel agent background gave Tammy a certain mystique that likely appealed to David's entrepreneurial side. She understood business, could speak intelligently about marketing and customer service, and seemed genuinely interested in helping him develop his clothing line. For a man who had been balancing work, parenting, and business dreams largely on his own, having a partner who wanted to be involved must have felt like a blessing. Friends would later remember seeing them together at social events, noting how attentive Tammy was to David, how she seemed to hang on his every word. She photographed well, was presentable at company gatherings, and appeared to be everything David had been hoping to find in a long-term partner. But there were things about Tammy Williams that David didn't know, couldn't know. Behind the carefully constructed persona of a successful travel agent and devoted girlfriend lay a more complicated reality. The travel industry can be transient, relationships there sometimes as temporary as the trips being planned. And for someone skilled in logistics and planning, someone who understood routes and destinations, the knowledge of how people move from place to place could prove useful in ways David never could have imagined. As September 2018 drew to a close, David Carter felt optimistic about his future. His business was growing, his children were thriving, and he had found someone who seemed to want to share in all of it. On the evening of September 28, as he prepared to attend his son's football game with Tammy by his side, David had every reason to believe that his life was finally falling into place. He had no way of knowing that the woman sitting beside him in the stadium bleachers was already planning his demise. September 28, 2018, was a Friday night in Melvindale, Michigan, and the air carried that perfect autumn crispness that made high school football feel like the most important thing in the world. David Carter had been looking forward to this game all week. His son was playing, and David never missed an opportunity to be there, cheering from the sidelines with the other parents and family members who understood that these moments were precious and fleeting. Tammy Williams joined him at the game, as she had become accustomed to doing during their 6 months together. To anyone watching from the stands, they looked like any other couple, David animated and enthusiastic as he followed every play, Tammy beside him, participating in the communal ritual of Friday night lights that binds so many American communities together. The game unfolded with all the drama and excitement that makes high school sports so compelling. There were great plays and missed opportunities, moments of triumph and disappointment, the ebb and flow of competition that keep spectators on the edge of their seats. David was in his element, calling out encouragement to his son and the other players, high-fiving other parents when things went well, offering words of support when they didn't. After the final whistle blew, David lingered as he always did. There were congratulations to offer, equipment to help gather, and those few extra moments with his son to recap the game and offer fatherly pride and guidance. These post-game rituals were sacred to David, part of what made being a parent so meaningful to him. Tammy waited patiently, observing the interactions between David and his son, between David and the other parents, between David and the coaches. She watched him in his natural habitat, surrounded by the community he loved and the family that defined him. To anyone observing, she appeared to be simply a supportive girlfriend, content to let David have his moment while she waited on the periphery. But what was really going through Tammy Williams' mind during those final hours? Was she already calculating distances and timelines? Was she thinking about the logistics of what was to come, using the skills she had honed in the travel industry to plan something far more sinister than any vacation itinerary? As the crowd began to disperse and the stadium lights dimmed, David and Tammy walked back toward the parking lot together. Other families were having similar conversations, replaying highlights from the game, making plans for the weekend, discussing the ordinary details of suburban life that seem so mundane until they're gone forever. David was probably feeling that particular contentment that comes from watching your child pursue their passions, from being present for the moments that matter. He had work the next day at the Magna plant, but it was the weekend, and there would be time to relax, maybe work on some designs for Lavish Habits Unlimited, perhaps spend some quiet time with Tammy. The drive home was likely filled with the kind of comfortable conversation that develops between two people who have been together long enough to share the small observations and gentle teasing that make up the fabric of an intimate relationship. David probably talked about his son's performance in the game, maybe shared some plans for the weekend, or discussed ideas for the clothing business that was never far from his thoughts. What neither David nor anyone else at that football game could have known was that this ordinary Friday night, filled with the simple pleasures of community, family, and young love, would be the last time David Carter would be seen alive by anyone who cared about him. Somewhere between the stadium and home, between the normal rhythms of a life well lived and the darkness that was about to unfold, David Carter's story took a turn toward tragedy that no one could have predicted and from which there would be no return. The first sign that something was wrong came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet accumulation of missed connections that signal when someone has simply vanished from their normal life. David Carter was nothing if not reliable. He showed up for work, answered his phone, kept his commitments, and stayed in regular contact with his family. When that pattern broke, people noticed. October 1, 2018, was a Monday, and David was scheduled to work his shift at the Magna seating plant. When he didn't show up, his supervisors were surprised but not immediately alarmed. People get sick, have car trouble, deal with family emergencies. But when Monday became Tuesday, and Tuesday became Wednesday, and there was still no word from David, concern began to build. His family tried calling his cell phone repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. This was not like David at all. Even if he was dealing with some kind of personal crisis, he would have found a way to let people know he was okay. He was too considerate, too aware of how much people cared about him, to simply disappear without explanation. By October 3, David's father knew something was seriously wrong. A parent's intuition about their adult child can be remarkably acute, and David's family members had that sinking feeling that comes when someone you love has simply vanished from their normal life. They called hospitals, checked with friends, and tried to piece together David's last known movements. The trail led them back to Friday night, September 28, and David's attendance at his son's football game. Multiple witnesses could confirm that David had been there, that he had seemed normal and happy, that he had left with Tammy Williams. But after that, it was as if David Carter had simply evaporated. On October 4, David's family filed an official missing person report with the Melvindale Police Department. The officers who took the report found themselves looking at a case that didn't fit the usual patterns. David wasn't the type to simply walk away from his responsibilities. He had no history of mental health issues that might explain a sudden disappearance. There were no financial problems that might have prompted him to start over somewhere else. He wasn't involved in anything illegal that might have necessitated going into hiding. Detective work in missing person cases often begins with the last known associates, and all roads led to Tammy Williams. She was the last person known to have been with David, and she was his girlfriend. Statistically, intimate partners are often involved when someone disappears under mysterious circumstances. But when investigators tried to contact Tammy, they discovered something interesting. She seemed to have vanished as well. The apartment where Tammy had been staying was empty. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her travel agent colleagues hadn't seen or heard from her since around the time David was last seen. It was as if two people had simultaneously decided to disappear from their lives in Melvindale, Michigan, leaving behind only questions and worried family members. Meanwhile, about 100 miles to the south, Ohio State Highway Patrol officers were dealing with a grisly discovery along Interstate 75. What they found would soon connect to the missing person case in Michigan, but in ways that would shock everyone involved and transform David Carter from a missing person into the victim of one of the most brutal crimes the region had seen in years. The quiet disappearance was about to become a murder investigation that would span multiple states and capture national attention. Interstate 75 cuts through Ohio like a major artery, carrying thousands of travelers daily between the industrial cities of the Midwest and the warmer destinations to the south. It's a highway that has witnessed countless stories: families heading to Disney World, college students traveling between semesters, business travelers making their appointed rounds. But on October 5, 2018, 75 became the scene of a discovery that would haunt everyone involved. Ohio State Highway Patrol officers responding to reports of suspicious items along the roadside found themselves confronting something that would challenge even their experienced perspectives on human tragedy. Scattered along the highway in 3 separate locations were black garbage bags containing what appeared to be human remains. The scene was methodically documented by crime scene technicians, but even these professionals, trained to approach the most disturbing evidence with clinical detachment, found themselves shaken by what they encountered. The bags contained the dismembered remains of what was clearly a human victim, and the condition of the remains suggested this was not the result of an accident or natural death. What they had discovered were the carefully concealed remnants of David Carter, though at that moment, investigators had no idea who the victim was or how he had ended up distributed along a major Ohio highway. The forensic analysis that would identify David and piece together the circumstances of his death would take time, but even these initial observations painted a picture of methodical violence. The location of the bags was not random. They had been placed at intervals along the highway, suggesting that whoever had disposed of them had wanted to ensure the remains would be found but had also tried to make identification and investigation as difficult as possible. This was not the work of someone acting in a moment of passion or panic. It showed planning, calculation, and a chilling attention to detail. Forensic experts began the painstaking process of collecting and analyzing the evidence. DNA samples would need to be extracted and compared against missing person databases. The condition of the remains would need to be assessed to determine cause of death. The bags themselves would be examined for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other clues that might lead investigators to whoever was responsible. As this forensic work was underway in Ohio, the missing person investigation in Michigan was intensifying. David Carter's family continued to grow more worried with each passing day. His absence from work, his failure to contact anyone, and his complete radio silence were so unlike him that his family members knew with growing certainty that something terrible had happened. The break in the case came when forensic analysts in Ohio successfully extracted DNA from the remains and ran it through national databases. The match came back to David Carter, the missing man from Melvindale, Michigan. Suddenly, 2 separate investigations, one focused on a missing person, another on an unidentified murder victim, became a single, complex case that would require coordination between law enforcement agencies in multiple states. The news that David Carter was not just missing but had been murdered sent shockwaves through his community in Melvindale. This wasn't the kind of crime that happened to people like David, devoted fathers, hard-working community members, men who volunteered with youth sports and started small businesses. This was the kind of violence that seemed to belong in a different world entirely. But perhaps most chilling of all was the methodical nature of the crime. The evidence suggested that David had been not just killed, but dismembered and disposed of with careful planning. This wasn't a crime of passion that had spiraled out of control, it was something far more calculated and cold-blooded. As investigators in both Michigan and Ohio began to coordinate their efforts, all attention turned to the one person who had been with David Carter on the night he disappeared and who had also vanished around the same time. Tammy Williams. With David Carter's remains identified and the case officially becoming a homicide investigation, law enforcement agencies in Michigan and Ohio found themselves facing a complex puzzle that crossed state lines and involved levels of violence that shocked even veteran investigators. The methodical nature of the crime suggested careful planning, and all evidence pointed toward one person, Tammy Williams. Detective work began to paint a clearer picture of the relationship between David and Tammy, and what investigators found raised troubling questions about how well David had really known the woman he had been dating for 6 months. The travel agent background that had seemed so professional and respectable now took on more sinister implications. Someone with expertise in logistics, routes, and transportation would have knowledge that could prove useful in planning and executing this type of crime. As investigators dug deeper into Tammy's background, they discovered that her life was more complicated than the stable, professional image she had presented to David and his family. There were gaps in her employment history, questions about her financial situation, and indications that she had been less than truthful about various aspects of her past. The forensic evidence from the crime scene was particularly damning. While investigators have not publicly released all the details of what they found, sources close to the investigation have indicated that the evidence strongly suggests Tammy Williams was involved in both David's murder and the disposal of his body. The level of planning required to execute this crime and then transport the remains from Michigan to Ohio suggested someone with both criminal intent and logistical expertise. But perhaps most frustrating for investigators was the fact that by the time they had enough evidence to arrest Tammy Williams, she had vanished completely. It was as if she had anticipated that the investigation would eventually focus on her and had prepared an exit strategy in advance. Law enforcement agencies issued bulletins for Tammy Williams, but she seemed to have evaporated as completely as David Carter had in those first days of October. Her apartment was empty, her car was nowhere to be found, and her phone had gone silent. Unlike David's disappearance, which had been completely out of character and immediately concerning to those who knew him, Tammy's vanishing act had the hallmarks of careful preparation. The investigation revealed that Tammy had made several purchases and arrangements in the days leading up to David's disappearance that, in retrospect, looked like preparation for going on the run. She had accessed cash, made certain purchases that would be useful for someone planning to disappear, and had apparently made arrangements to leave the area quickly when the time came. David's family, meanwhile, was struggling to process not just the loss of their beloved son, father, and brother, but the horrific circumstances of his death. The man they had known as gentle, trusting, and always looking for the best in people had been betrayed by someone he had cared about and trusted. The violation was almost as difficult to bear as the grief itself. The football community where David had volunteered, his co-workers at the Magna plant, and the customers who had supported his lavish habits unlimited clothing line all struggled to make sense of how someone so positive and full of life could have met such a brutal end. Memorial services drew hundreds of people whose lives David had touched in ways both large and small. But even as the community mourned and investigators worked to build their case against Tammy Williams, the fundamental question remained unanswered: where was she? The search for Tammy Williams became a priority for law enforcement agencies across the Midwest and eventually throughout the entire country. Here was a woman who had allegedly committed one of the most brutal murders in recent memory, and then had simply vanished without a trace. The challenge facing investigators was both immediate and long-term: where had she gone, and how could someone disappear so completely in an age of digital surveillance and interconnected databases? The answer, investigators would learn, lay partly in Tammy's background in the travel industry. Her professional experience had given her knowledge of transportation systems, booking procedures, and the kind of logistical planning that could help someone disappear. She understood how people move from place to place, how to avoid leaving digital footprints, and how to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts to track her movements. In the weeks following David Carter's murder, investigators pieced together a timeline of Tammy's activities that suggested she had been planning her disappearance even before the crime was committed. There were cash withdrawals, purchases of items that would be useful for someone living off the grid, and arrangements that indicated she had anticipated needing to leave quickly. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources to bear on what had become an interstate manhunt. Tammy Williams was added to the U.S. Marshals' 15 Most Wanted list, making her one of the most sought-after fugitives in the country. Her photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, and tips began pouring in from across the country. But each potential sighting led nowhere. Someone matching her description had been seen in Florida, but by the time investigators arrived, the trail had gone cold. There were reports from Texas, California, and various other states, but none of them panned out. It was as if Tammy Williams had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The investigation revealed just how methodical Tammy had been in planning her escape. She had apparently studied techniques used by other fugitives, understanding how to avoid the kind of mistakes that typically lead to capture. She avoided using credit cards, stayed away from locations where she might be recognized, and seemed to have planned multiple backup strategies for remaining hidden. For David Carter's family, the inability of law enforcement to locate Tammy Williams added another layer of frustration to their grief. Not only had they lost David in the most horrific way imaginable, but the person responsible remained free, potentially planning to hurt someone else. The fact that she had demonstrated such careful planning in both the murder and her escape made her seem particularly dangerous. Months turned into years, and still there was no sign of Tammy Williams. The case began to take on the characteristics of other famous fugitive hunts. The longer someone remains at large, the more legendary their ability to evade capture becomes. But investigators remained convinced that Tammy was not some criminal mastermind. She was simply someone who had planned carefully and gotten lucky. The break investigators were hoping for would eventually come from an unexpected source: the growing popularity of true crime content and the power of social media to amplify law enforcement efforts. In October 2022, 4 years after David Carter's murder and Tammy Williams' disappearance, the case found new life through Netflix's popular series, Unsolved Mysteries. The episode, titled "Body in Bags," brought David's story to millions of viewers around the world and reminded the public that a dangerous fugitive remained at large. The power of modern media to assist in law enforcement efforts cannot be underestimated. Where traditional wanted posters reached limited audiences, streaming television and social media can put a fugitive's face in front of millions of people in a matter of days. The Unsolved Mysteries episode not only detailed the horrific circumstances of David's murder but also provided detailed descriptions of Tammy Williams and the various locations where she might be hiding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days of the episode's release, law enforcement agencies received over 90 tips from viewers who believed they had seen Tammy Williams or had information about her possible whereabouts. Each tip had to be investigated, verified, and followed up on, a massive undertaking that required coordination between multiple agencies. Some of the tips seemed promising. There were reports from people who were certain they had seen Tammy in various locations around the country, from small towns in rural states to major metropolitan areas. Other tips provided information about her possible associates, people who might be helping her remain hidden, or locations where she was known to have connections. But as investigators worked through each lead, the pattern that had characterized the search from the beginning continued. Tammy Williams remained one step ahead, always seeming to vanish just before law enforcement could close in. The volume of tips was encouraging. It meant that people were paying attention and wanted to help, but each dead end added to the frustration of a case that seemed unsolvable. The publicity also had another important effect. It reminded the public that David Carter had been more than just a victim. The episode showcased his life, his dedication to his family, his involvement in youth sports, and his entrepreneurial dreams. Viewers came to understand that this wasn't just another true crime story. It was about a real person whose life had been cut short by unthinkable violence. David's family participated in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, sharing their memories of him and their ongoing pain at his loss. Their dignity and strength in the face of such tragedy moved viewers and helped humanize a story that could otherwise have been reduced to its most sensational elements. The episode also highlighted the ongoing danger that Tammy Williams potentially represented to the public. This wasn't someone who had committed a crime of passion and was likely to disappear quietly. The methodical nature of David's murder suggested someone capable of extreme violence who had already demonstrated the ability to plan and execute complex criminal schemes. As 2024 rolled around, the case remained active but frustrating. Despite the increased publicity, despite the federal resources dedicated to the search, despite the thousands of tips and leads that had been investigated, Tammy Williams remained a ghost. As we move through 2025, the search for Tammy Williams continues with the same intensity that has characterized the investigation since David Carter's murder in 2018. She remains on the U.S. Marshals' 15 Most Wanted list, a distinction that keeps her case in front of law enforcement agencies nationwide and ensures that the search for her remains a priority. The passage of time has not diminished investigators' determination to bring Tammy Williams to justice. If anything, the years that have passed have only strengthened their resolve. This is no longer just about solving David Carter's murder. It's about demonstrating that even the most carefully planned crimes cannot guarantee escape from justice forever. Modern technology continues to evolve in ways that make it increasingly difficult for fugitives to remain hidden indefinitely. Facial recognition software, digital surveillance systems, and improved database sharing between agencies all work against someone trying to live under the radar. Investigators believe that eventually, these technological advances will contribute to Tammy Williams' capture. The reward for information leading to her arrest has grown to $25,000, a substantial sum that reflects both the seriousness of the crime and law enforcement's commitment to solving the case. The reward has generated additional tips and continues to keep the case in the public eye. For David Carter's family, the passage of time has brought some healing but no closure. They continue to live with the reality that the person who took David from them remains free, potentially living a new life somewhere while they continue to grieve his loss. The strength they have shown throughout this ordeal has been remarkable, and their continued cooperation with law enforcement efforts demonstrates their commitment to seeing justice done. The community in Melvindale, Michigan, has not forgotten David Carter. The youth football program where he volunteered continues to honor his memory, and his entrepreneurial dreams live on through the people he inspired with his optimism and determination. His clothing line, Lavish Habits Unlimited, became a symbol of his creativity and ambition, reminders of a life that was building towards something meaningful. Investigators remain confident that Tammy Williams will eventually be captured. The resources dedicated to finding her, the ongoing publicity surrounding the case, and the simple reality that maintaining a hidden identity becomes more difficult with each passing year all work in law enforcement's favor. They believe it's not a matter of if she will be caught, but when. The case has also contributed to important discussions about domestic violence and the warning signs that might help others avoid similar tragedies. While the relationship between David and Tammy appeared normal to outside observers, experts in domestic violence point out that perpetrators can be extremely skilled at hiding their true nature, especially in the early stages of relationships. As I bring this account to a close, it's important to remember that this is a story without a proper ending. David Carter's murder has been solved in the sense that investigators know who killed him and how the crime was committed. But justice has not been served because Tammy Williams remains a fugitive, somewhere in a country of more than 330 million people, potentially living under a new identity while David's family continues to wait for closure. The case serves as a reminder of several sobering realities about modern life. It shows us how someone can present a carefully constructed facade while harboring the darkest intentions. It demonstrates how even in our connected, surveilled world, it's still possible for someone to disappear if they plan carefully and get lucky. And it illustrates the ripple effects of violent crime, how one person's evil actions can devastate not just the immediate victim, but families, communities, and everyone who comes into contact with the story. David Carter was 39 years old when he died, with so much life still ahead of him. His children were still growing up, still needing their father's guidance and love. His business was just getting started, his dreams still taking shape. The youth football players he mentored lost a role model and friend. The community lost someone who made it a little bit better just by being part of it. Somewhere, Tamara Williams knows that people are looking for her. She knows that her photograph is in law enforcement databases across the country, that investigators continue to follow leads and analyze tips. She knows that every time her story is told, in podcasts, television shows, news articles, and videos like this one, there's a chance that someone who has seen her will recognize her and contact authorities. The passage of time works against fugitives in subtle but important ways. Maintaining a false identity becomes increasingly difficult as years pass. The stress of constantly looking over your shoulder, of never being able to truly relax or form genuine relationships, takes a psychological toll that few people can sustain indefinitely. And as the years go by, the skills and resources needed to stay hidden may become harder to maintain. For those listening to this story, David Carter's case serves as a reminder to cherish the ordinary moments, Friday night football games, conversations with family, the simple pleasure of pursuing your dreams surrounded by people who love you. These seemingly mundane experiences are actually the substance of a life well lived, and they can be taken away more suddenly and violently than we like to imagine. If you have information about Tammy Williams, if you think you might have seen her or know someone who has, please contact your local law enforcement agency or the U.S. Marshal Service. She is described as a black female, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing between 180 and 200 pounds, with a distinctive large rose tattoo running from her shoulder down her left arm. David Carter deserves justice. His family deserves closure. And the public deserves to know that someone who committed such a carefully planned and brutal crime cannot simply disappear into the American landscape and start over with impunity. Until Tammy Williams is captured and brought to trial, this remains a story without an ending, a reminder that in the world of true crime, not every case concludes with satisfaction, and not every victim receives the justice they deserve. But investigators haven't given up. David's family continues to hope, and somewhere out there, someone knows something that could bring this long chapter to a close. The hunt for Tamara Williams continues, and with each passing day, the odds grow slightly better that justice will finally be served for David Carter, a man who deserved so much more than the brutal end that was chosen for him by someone he trusted and cared about. Rest in peace, David Carter. Your story lives on, and the search for justice in your name will continue until the very end. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.